What if the story you thought you knew was only the surface? Before empires rose, before laws were written, and before power wore a crown, there was a world shaped by memory, silence, and choice. This is not just the story of Moses and Pharaoh. It is the story of freedom confronting eternity, of a people learning to live without chains and without gods walking beside them. Tonight, we return to ancient Egypt, to burning mountains, parted waters, and a wilderness that changed history forever. This is not a tale of miracles. It is a story about responsibility, loss, and the price of freedom. Close your eyes and let the past speak.
Chapter 1. Egypt Before Prophecy.
Before Moses, before the river carried a hidden child among reeds, before a staff would ever rise against a throne, there was Egypt, not simply a kingdom, but a world that believed itself eternal. Egypt did not see time as a straight path moving forward. To the ancient Egyptian mind, time was circular, endlessly repeating, returning again and again to the same sacred moments. What had been would come again, what existed would endure, and nothing truly ended, it only transformed. This belief shaped everything in Egypt: the land, the people, the temples, and above all, the man who ruled from the throne. Pharaoh was not merely a ruler chosen by the gods. He was believed to be the living embodiment of divine order itself. His task was not conquest or innovation, but preservation. The Egyptians called this order Ma'at. Ma'at was not simply justice or morality. It was the invisible structure of reality, the harmony that allowed the sun to rise each morning, the Nile to flood in its season, crops to grow, stars to follow their courses, and the dead to rest peacefully beyond life. As long as Ma'at endured, the universe remained stable. If it fractured, chaos would follow. Pharaoh existed to prevent that collapse. His authority came not from fear, but from necessity. Each day in Egypt began with rituals meant to sustain reality itself. Sacred words were spoken exactly as they had been for generations. Gestures were repeated without change. Ceremonies followed ancient patterns with no space for improvisation. Change was dangerous, because change threatened balance. Temples were engines of stability, and priests were custodians of the unseen order that held the world together. According to Egypt's oldest traditions, kingship did not begin with human beings. Long before the first dynasties, the gods themselves were said to have ruled the land. Osiris brought civilization, Isis guarded hidden knowledge, Horus governed the living world, and Pharaoh was considered Horus living on earth. When Pharaoh died, he did not disappear. He became Osiris, ruler of the unseen realm, ensuring continuity rather than ending. Kingship never ceased. It only changed form. This belief made Egypt unshakable. Kingdoms beyond the Nile rose and fell, deserts swallowed cities, foreign lands vanished into memory, but Egypt endured. The river returned each year, the stars never failed, and monuments grew larger with every generation. The pyramids were not monuments to death, but defenses against it. Each stone was aligned with the heavens, each passage angled towards stars that never set. Egypt did not fear endings, because it believed endings did not exist. Yet eternity breeds certainty, and certainty breeds blindness. A civilization that believes it cannot fall eventually stops listening. As Egypt expanded, strangers arrived quietly from the east. Semitic tribes came seeking food and survival. At first, they were welcomed, useful as laborers and herders. They settled in the fertile delta and multiplied. But unlike others, they did not dissolve into Egyptian identity. They remembered who they were. Their identity was not bound to temples or monuments, but to lineage, story, and promise. A new pharaoh arose, one who did not remember Joseph. This was not simple forgetfulness, but fear. The Hebrews were becoming too many. If conflict came, where would their loyalty lie? Fear demanded action, and action demanded justification. Egypt did not see what followed as cruelty, but as necessity. Ma'at had to be preserved. Balance had to hold. A decree was issued that every male Hebrew child was to be cast into the Nile, not executed, but returned. The river was sacred, a giver and taker of life. The river would decide. But myths often turn on irony. The very waters meant to erase a future would instead carry it forward. What approached was not a rebellion, but a challenge to the foundations of reality itself. Pharaoh represented an ancient order built on cycles, ritual, and divine kingship. What was coming would represent something new, a single, unseen God, a story that moved forward rather than endlessly returning to the past. Egypt did not yet sense the fracture forming beneath its certainty. The temples still stood, the rituals still worked, the stars still moved, and the Nile still flooded. Everything appeared stable. But stability can be deceptive. Systems built on permanence often shatter without warning. Somewhere in the quiet shadows of the delta, a mother was making a choice. A basket was being woven, and a river was waiting. Egypt, eternal and unbreakable, was about to face something it could not absorb. Not force, not revolt, but destiny itself.
Chapter 2. The Child of the River.
The decree did not arrive with horns or proclamations. It moved quietly, carried by fear. Mothers whispered it in doorways. Fathers read it in the eyes of guards who lingered too long. Every male child born to the Hebrews would be taken and cast into the Nile. Egypt called it preservation. The Hebrews felt it as erasure. Life continued on the surface. The river still flowed. The sun still rose. But beneath it all, birth itself had become dangerous. In a hidden household within the delta, a child was born who should not have lived. His mother looked upon him and understood what the law demanded. Yet ancient stories often begin with refusal. For 3 months she hid him, silencing his cries, guarding his existence against a world that had already decided his fate. But secrecy has weight. Walls listen. Fear grows. Time presses forward, and even love cannot stop it. When hiding was no longer possible, she turned to the river, not as execution, but as surrender. She wove a basket of papyrus and sealed it with pitch, crafting not a coffin, but a vessel. The Nile was not merely water. It was ancient, sacred, and feared. It fed Egypt, shaped its calendar, and claimed its sacrifices. To place the child upon its surface was to return him to the force that ruled the land itself. She set him among the reeds and stepped away, believing not that she had saved him, but that she had placed him beyond her own control. The river carried him gently, not toward disappearance, but toward power. Pharaoh's daughter came to the water in accordance with ritual. She heard a sound that did not belong to the river, a cry that cut through the stillness. When she found the basket and opened it, she saw a child condemned by her father's decree. In that moment, she stood between order and instinct, between law and compassion. She chose compassion, and with that choice, altered the future of Egypt itself. The irony was complete. The decree meant to erase a future delivered it into the palace itself. The child was named Moses, drawn from the water. He grew within walls of stone and ceremony, surrounded by symbols of eternity. He learned the language of authority, the rituals of kingship, and the belief that Egypt was the center of the world. He was taught that order flowed from Pharaoh, and chaos waited beyond the borders. Yet identity resists erasure. Moses sensed his difference long before he could name it. He belonged fully to neither world. To the Egyptians, he was never entirely one of them. To the Hebrews, he was distant, elevated, unreachable. He walked corridors of power while carrying a past that did not fit within them. His life existed in tension, suspended between origin and privilege, memory and denial. The fracture came suddenly. Moses witnessed an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew laborer. What Egypt justified as necessity revealed itself as cruelty. The violence was no longer abstract. It was immediate. Personal. Moses acted, striking the overseer and killing him. The moment could not be undone. The system that raised him now marked him as a threat. Pharaoh learned of the act, and Egypt responded as it always did, with removal. Moses fled into the desert, from stone and ritual into sand and silence. The desert offered no monuments, no cycles, no certainty. Time stretched differently there. It stripped him down. He became a shepherd, learning patience beneath open skies. The stars were no longer symbols carved in temples, but living guides. Silence became teacher. Egypt had shaped his mind. The wilderness reshaped his soul. Years passed. Egypt remained unchanged. The Hebrews remained bound. Pharaoh still ruled as the embodiment of permanence. But something had shifted beyond Egypt's awareness. The man formed within its system had been undone by exile, emptied so something else could take form. Then fire appeared in the wilderness. A bush burned without being consumed. Moses approached, not in worship, but curiosity. The voice that spoke did not offer image or form. It named itself as existence itself. I am that I am. Not a god of cycles or monuments, but something beyond containment. The command was impossible. Return to Egypt. Confront Pharaoh. Lead the people out. Moses resisted. He doubted. He argued. But destiny does not require certainty, only movement. The coming confrontation would not be between two men, but between two realities. Pharaoh embodied repetition and permanence. Moses carried interruption and promise. A force not bound to land, image, or cycle was about to challenge a world built on eternal return. Egypt did not yet know the fracture was approaching. The river still flooded, the sun still rose, the temples still echoed with ancient chants. But the child, drawn from the water, had returned as a messenger of change. The cycle was about to be broken.
Chapter 3: Signs Against Eternity. Moses returned to Egypt not as a prince and not as a fugitive, but as a messenger shaped by silence. He carried no army, no symbols of authority, no claim recognizable to Egyptian power. What he brought could not be weighed or displayed. It did not belong to temples, nor did it submit to ritual. Egypt, ancient and confident in its permanence, did not yet understand that the threat standing before it was not rebellion, but interruption. Pharaoh received Moses with formal restraint. Courtesy demanded an audience, not belief. Moses spoke with no ornament. "Let my people go." The words were simple, but their meaning cut deep. They implied that Pharaoh did not own what Egypt believed was his by divine necessity, not labor, not lineage, not even the future itself. Pharaoh answered from certainty rather than anger. "Who is this God that I should obey him?" Egypt knew many gods, gods with images, stories, temples, and jurisdictions older than memory. A god without form was not a god. A command without ritual was chaos. Pharaoh refused, and with that refusal, the structure of Egypt's reality began to fracture. The first sign came through the Nile. Its waters darkened, fish died, and decay replaced renewal. The river that defined Egypt's calendar, economy, and identity no longer fulfilled its role. This was not simple disaster, it was symbolic violation. The Nile had always been dependable, its cycles were predictable, its flood was life itself. Now it unsettled. Pharaoh dismissed it as coincidence. Egypt had endured irregular floods before. Order always returned. But order did not return. Frogs emerged next, multiplying beyond measure. They flooded homes, beds, kitchens, and temples. Boundaries collapsed. Creatures once associated with fertility and rebirth now became instruments of intrusion. Sacred spaces lost distinction. The natural world invaded the constructed one. Pharaoh resisted. Egypt responded as it always had, with repetition. Rituals were performed precisely, incantations spoken exactly as before. Balance would reassert itself. Gnats and lice followed, small, relentless, unseen. The air itself became hostile. Priests attempted their arts, but their power faltered. For the first time, Egypt's magic failed to imitate what Moses' God had done. Quietly, among themselves, the priests spoke words they dared not say aloud. "This power is not ours." Yet Pharaoh's resolve remained. To yield was to unravel the logic of kingship itself. Flies swarmed next, thick enough to darken rooms and corrupt offerings. Then disease struck the livestock. Animals that powered agriculture, transport, and sacrifice collapsed in the fields. The economy weakened. The rhythm of labor broke. Egypt's wealth bled away silently. Still, Pharaoh refused. Order, he believed, could absorb loss. Boils followed. Physical suffering touched bodies once believed protected by divine favor. Priests withdrew from temples, unable to perform rituals while marked by illness. Ceremonies halted. The machinery of order stalled. Egypt hesitated. Then the sky turned hostile. Hail mixed with fire shattered crops and trees. Egypt had mapped the heavens, aligned monuments to stars, and believed the sky obedient. Now it punished. Pharaoh wavered. He summoned Moses. He spoke words of regret, promises of release. But when the storm passed, certainty returned. Regret without transformation fades quickly. Darkness came next, not night, not eclipse, a suffocating absence of light that pressed inward. Lamps failed, movement ceased. For 3 days Egypt sat frozen. The sun, embodiment of Ra and foundation of divine kingship, vanished. Pharaoh ruled through its authority. Without it, his rule stood exposed. Yet still he refused. The signs were not meant to destroy Egypt. They were revelations. Each one stripped away a pillar of belief: water, fertility, health, sky, light. This was not chaos, it was exposure. The order Egypt worshipped was not eternal, it was contingent. The final night arrived without warning. Across Egypt the firstborn fell. Symbols of continuity, inheritance, and future vanished in silence. From palace to prison, loss moved without distinction. Pharaoh's own house was not spared. Kingship without succession is emptiness. Eternity fractured in a single night. Before dawn, Pharaoh summoned Moses. The language of command was gone. What remained was urgency and collapse. Leave, take your people, go. Egypt no longer held them. The Hebrews departed in haste, carrying what little they could. Egypt watched in silence, wounded and hollow. The civilization that believed itself unending stood exposed. But departure is rarely final. Grief hardened into rage. Loss demanded restoration. Pharaoh gathered his forces. Slaves were property. Order demanded return. The sea stood before the fleeing people, water once again marking the boundary between worlds. Moses raised his staff. The waters parted. A path opened where none should exist. When Egypt followed, the waters returned. Chariots vanished. Soldiers disappeared. Power dissolved beneath the surface. Egypt endured. Temples remained. Pharaohs would still rule. But something essential was gone. The illusion of eternity had been broken.
Chapter 4: The Crossing and the Collapse of Power. The sea did not open with thunder. It parted in silence. Before it moved, there was hesitation. The people stood at the edge of the water, with fear behind them and uncertainty ahead. Egypt's dust still clung to their clothes. The sound of chariots echoed in the distance, growing closer with every breath. Freedom had been granted, then immediately threatened. This was the first lesson of departure. Leaving is not the same as being free. The sea stood as a boundary older than memory. Water had always been both barrier and passage. In Egypt, it gave life through the Nile. Here, it blocked escape. The people cried out, not to Moses, but against him. "Why did you bring us here to die? At least in Egypt we understood our suffering." The unknown demanded more than endurance. It demanded trust. Moses stood between the people and the water, carrying a command that could not be proven until it was obeyed. He raised his staff, not as a weapon, but as a sign of movement. The wind rose slowly, steady and relentless. The surface of the sea pulled back, revealing a path where no path should exist. Walls of water stood on either side, trembling, held apart by something unseen. The people moved forward cautiously at first, then with urgency, then with desperation. Feet pressed into damp ground that had never known footsteps. Children were carried, elders leaned on memory. Every step was a break from what had always been. The sea did not promise safety, it only offered passage. When Egypt reached the water, it followed. Pharaoh's chariots entered the path with confidence. Power had always moved forward. The sea had never defied Egypt before, but certainty is fragile when built on repetition. The ground shifted, wheels sank, order faltered. The walls of water collapsed inward, reclaiming the path. The sea did not chase, it simply returned to itself. Silence followed. The most powerful force the people had ever known vanished beneath the surface. No victory song came immediately, only disbelief. Egypt had defined the limits of the world. Now those limits were gone. The people stood on the opposite shore, not yet free, but no longer pursued. Freedom, it turns out, is heavier than chains. The wilderness opened before them. No walls, no markers, no calendars. Egypt had told them when to wake, when to work, when to rest. Now time stretched unmeasured. The sky offered no instructions. The land provided no certainty. Without Pharaoh, without overseers, without routine, the people felt exposed. They had left slavery behind, but they had not yet left Egypt within them. Food became a question, water became fear. Memory reshaped itself. They spoke of Egypt not as a place of suffering, but of predictability. At least there we knew what tomorrow would bring. The wilderness answered nothing. It demanded patience, something slavery had never required. Provision came, but not in familiar forms. Bread appeared with the morning dew, fragile and temporary. It could not be stored, it could not be hoarded. Each day required return to trust. Water came from stone, not river. Nothing followed the old rules. Survival now depended not on control, but on reception. This was the deeper collapse of power. Not Egypt's destruction, but its irrelevance. Pharaoh ruled a world built on permanence. Slavery depended on cycles. Work repeated. Time closed in on itself. The wilderness broke that structure completely. Days moved forward without repetition. No empire thrives where the future cannot be predicted. The people struggled. They argued. They longed for leaders to replace Pharaoh, someone to decide for them, someone to restore certainty. Freedom without structure felt like chaos, and chaos frightened them more than chains ever had. Moses carried the weight of expectation and doubt. He was no longer confronting Pharaoh, but his own people. Egypt had fallen behind them, but its shadow remained. They had escaped power, but not dependence. The wilderness did not hurry them. It stretched time until impatience surfaced, until longing for the familiar overwhelmed the memory of oppression. This was not punishment, it was transformation. A people shaped by command had to learn movement without command. The crossing of the sea was not the end of Egypt's power. It was the moment its meaning collapsed. Behind them lay monuments, hierarchies, and gods bound to stone and sky. Ahead lay nothing but distance. No cities, no walls, no thrones, only movement forward. The sea closed, and with it the old world. What remained was uncertainty. And that uncertainty would become the place where a new identity was formed.
Chapter 5. The Wilderness. Freedom without order. Freedom did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with silence. Beyond the sea, there were no cities waiting, no gates opening, no promised land visible on the horizon. There was only space, endless, unmarked, indifferent space. The wilderness did not celebrate their escape. It did not acknowledge their suffering. It offered no instructions, no reassurance. It simply existed. For generations, the people had lived inside structure. Every hour had been assigned, every movement observed. Even suffering had followed a predictable rhythm. Slavery, for all its cruelty, had removed the burden of decision. Now that burden returned with force. Freedom demanded choice, and choice required responsibility. The people were unprepared for both. Hunger came first, not starvation, but uncertainty, the kind that gnaws quietly, that turns thought inward and memory backward. They remembered Egypt's food, not its chains. Memory reshaped itself to ease discomfort. At least there we ate. At least there we slept beneath roofs. At least there we knew tomorrow. The wilderness offered no such certainty. Each day arrived without promise. When food appeared with the morning dew, it confused them. It did not resemble anything they knew. It could not be stored. It melted with the sun. They were instructed to gather only what was needed for the day. This was not provision in the Egyptian sense. It was dependency without control, trust without accumulation. The people resisted it instinctively. They tried to hoard. The food spoiled. The lesson repeated. You cannot carry yesterday into tomorrow. Water followed the same pattern. It appeared where it should not exist, drawn from stone rather than river. Egypt had taught them that water flowed predictably. The wilderness taught them that survival now depended on attention rather than expectation. Nothing could be assumed. Everything had to be received. This was freedom without order. The people grew restless. They argued. They blamed Moses. Why did you bring us here? Why did you strip us of what little certainty we had? Their anger was not rebellion. It was fear searching for direction. They had removed Pharaoh, but they still wanted someone to replace him, someone to decide, someone to command. Freedom felt too open, too exposed. Moses felt the weight of this more than anyone. Leading people out was one thing. Leading them forward was another. Egypt had been a single enemy. The wilderness was invisible. It attacked patience, memory, and trust. There was nothing to confront, nothing to defeat, only endurance. The nights were colder than expected. The sky stretched endlessly above them, stars no longer symbols carved into stone, but living presence. Time slowed, days blurred. Without calendars, without festivals, without cycles, the people lost their sense of progression. They were moving, but toward what? Freedom without direction felt like abandonment. And yet, something subtle was happening. Without walls, the people began to see one another differently. Families depended on each other. Elders spoke more. Stories surfaced. Identity, once reduced to labor, began to stretch outward. They were no longer bricks in a structure. They were individuals in a moving body. The wilderness stripped them down, but it also revealed them. Still, fear persisted. When enemies appeared at the edges of the camp, panic returned. Slavery had taught them to wait for orders. Now, reaction was required. They fought not as an army, but as a people discovering their own strength. Victory did not feel triumphant. It felt surprising. They were learning who they were without permission. The absence of Egypt forced a question they had never needed to ask. Who are we without chains? The wilderness did not answer directly. It allowed tension to rise until answers formed slowly.
Trust was no longer enforced by threat, it had to be chosen daily. Faith was no longer inherited through ritual, it had to be practiced through uncertainty. Moses understood this transformation intuitively. Egypt had broken their bodies. The wilderness was reshaping their minds. A people shaped entirely by command could not enter a future built on choice. Slavery had to be unlearned before freedom could be lived. But unlearning is painful. Complaints grew louder. Nostalgia hardened into resentment. The people demanded structure. They demanded certainty. They demanded a return to what they knew, even if it meant suffering. Freedom was asking too much of them too quickly. The wilderness answered with delay. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Movement slowed, purpose blurred. This was not punishment, it was exposure. The people were being given space to confront what slavery had done to them internally. Egypt had trained them to obey. The wilderness was teaching them to listen. At night, a presence moved with them, not confined to temples, not represented by image, a guiding fire by night, a cloud by day, direction without domination, guidance without control. This presence did not push, it waited. Slowly, resistance softened, patterns formed. The people learned to gather, to rest, to move together. They learned that survival now depended on cooperation rather than command. They began to understand that freedom was not the absence of structure, but the creation of a new one. The wilderness was not empty, it was preparatory. What awaited them was not merely land, but law, not merely survival, but identity. Before they could receive it, they had to become something capable of holding it. Egypt had taken generations to shape them into slaves. The wilderness would take time to shape them into a people. And ahead, beyond the silence and the dust, a mountain waited.
Chapter 6. The Mountain, the Fire, and the Weight of Law.
The mountain did not announce itself with grandeur. It rose from the wilderness in silence, dark against the sky, unmoving and indifferent. It did not promise shelter or comfort. It simply waited. Long before the people reached it, they felt its presence. The air grew still. The movement of the camp slowed. Something ancient stood ahead, and it did not belong to them. They had crossed water, endured hunger, learned dependence, and survived uncertainty. But the mountain represented something different. Not escape, not survival, responsibility. Moses approached it alone. The people remained below, watching from a distance. They had followed him through fear and uncertainty, but this felt different. Egypt's gods had been visible. Their statues lined roads and temples. This presence offered no image, only fire and sound. The mountain burned without being consumed, echoing the fire Moses had once seen in the wilderness. What had called him then now confronted the people as a whole. Thunder rolled, smoke rose, the ground trembled, the people recoiled. This was not comfort, this was boundary. Do not come closer, do not cross this line. Freedom had removed Pharaoh's commands, but now limits returned in another form, not imposed by force, but declared by presence. Moses ascended into cloud and flame. Time stretched. The people waited. Waiting had once meant obedience. Now it meant uncertainty. Days passed. The mountain remained sealed in fire. Moses did not return. Anxiety filled the camp. Silence breeds fear when trust is incomplete. When Moses descended, he did not bring stories, he brought weight. What he carried was not suggestion, it was structure. Law not as domination, but as foundation.
a way of living that did not rely on masters or overseers, a framework that defined relationship, responsibility, and restraint. Freedom required limits to survive itself. The people listened, but understanding lagged behind hearing. The law did not resemble Egypt's commands. It did not regulate production or labor quotas. It addressed behavior, intention, and memory. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not dominate. Remember where you came from. Remember you were once bound. Authority was no longer vertical. It was communal. Every person carried responsibility. This frightened them more than Pharaoh ever had. Slavery had simplified morality, obey and survive. Freedom complicated it. Every action now mattered. Every choice had consequence. The law did not remove fear, it redistributed it. Moses spoke of covenant, not conquest, not inheritance through blood, agreement, relationship, mutual obligation. This was not how empires functioned. Egypt ruled through repetition and enforcement. This system demanded participation. The people agreed quickly, too quickly. They said yes before understanding what yes required. Then Moses returned to the mountain. Days passed again. Silence returned. The fire remained. The people waited without clarity. Uncertainty resurfaced. Egypt had always provided visible authority, a throne, a face, a command. This presence was invisible, distant, patient, too patient. Fear returned in another form. If this God will not stay among us, we must make something that will. Gold emerged from memory. Jewelry once taken from Egypt resurfaced. What had symbolized wealth now became material for reassurance. They shaped it into form, something visible, something familiar, something they could point to and say, "Here is what leads us." The calf was not rebellion, it was fear seeking certainty. When Moses descended and saw it, he understood what the mountain had demanded. Freedom without memory collapses into imitation. The people had not abandoned Egypt, they had recreated it. The law shattered on stone. What followed was not punishment alone, it was reckoning, a realization that liberation is not an event, it is a process. Egypt had trained them to trust symbols. The wilderness was asking them to trust absence. Moses returned to the mountain once more, not in anger, but in mediation. What came back was not destruction, but renewal. The law returned, not as threat, but as anchor, not to dominate, but to preserve. This was the turning point. The people began to understand that freedom required discipline, that memory required practice, that without structure, freedom dissolves into fear. The law was not meant to replace Pharaoh, it was meant to prevent another one. The mountain remained behind them, but its weight stayed. They would carry it forward into the wilderness, into conflict, into settlement, into memory. The fire faded, the thunder ceased, but the responsibility endured. They were no longer slaves. They were no longer wandering. They were becoming something else, and the wilderness still lay ahead.
Chapter 7: The Golden Calf and the Return of Chaos.
Chaos did not arrive suddenly. It crept back in quietly, disguised as certainty. The people had agreed to the covenant quickly, almost eagerly. They had stood before fire and thunder and spoken words of acceptance without fully understanding what they meant. Agreement was easy in the presence of awe. Commitment was harder in its absence. When Moses disappeared into the mountain once more, the weight of waiting returned. Days passed, then more days. The fire still burned above, but no voice reached them below. Silence began to feel like abandonment. The people looked at one another and saw fear reflected back. Egypt had always kept authority visible. Pharaoh ruled from a throne. Statues watched from every corner. Commands were spoken daily. This new order offered no image, no face, no immediate reassurance. Trust required memory, and memory was fragile. Questions turned into doubts. Doubts hardened into urgency. Moses is gone. The fire speaks, but it does not stay. We need something to lead us now. Gold emerged from hiding. It came from Egypt, carried unknowingly across the sea. Earrings, bracelets, symbols of status once given by masters to mark ownership, now they were repurposed, melted down, reshaped. What had once represented power was transformed into reassurance. The calf took form not as an act of rebellion, but as imitation. Egypt had always represented divine authority through image. The people were doing what they had been trained to do. They did not reject the unseen God. They attempted to replace uncertainty with familiarity. The calf stood polished and still. It did not speak. It did not command, but it was visible, and visibility felt like safety. The people gathered around it, celebrating not cruelty but relief. Here is something we can see. Here is something that stays. When Moses descended, he did not see worship alone. He saw regression. The law in his hands shattered against stone, not in rage, but recognition. The covenant had been spoken, but not yet lived. The people had crossed water, but not memory. Egypt had lost its throne, but not its imprint. What followed was not simply punishment, it was fracture. The camp divided. Order dissolved into confusion. The illusion that freedom could exist without discipline collapsed. Chaos returned, not as foreign force, but as inherited reflex. Moses stood between two worlds once more, not Egypt and wilderness, but past and future. The calf represented what they knew. The law represented what they were becoming. One could not coexist with the other. The destruction of the calf was symbolic. Gold returned to dust. The image dissolved. What remained was silence and consequence. The people mourned not the idol itself, but the certainty it had provided. Fear resurfaced, not fear of punishment, but fear of responsibility. Moses returned to the mountain again, this time not to receive law, but to repair relationship. What followed was waiting without spectacle. No thunder, no fire visible from below, only absence. When he returned, the law came again, not rewritten to accommodate weakness, but reaffirmed. This was not a reset, it was a deepening. The people were no longer innocent, they were accountable. Something shifted after that moment. The camp grew quieter, movement became deliberate, rituals formed not to replace trust, but to preserve it. Memory became practice, freedom slowly learned structure. The golden calf did not end the journey, it defined it. The people understood now that chaos was not behind them, it lived within them. Egypt had taught them to obey images, the wilderness was teaching them to live without them. From that point forward, the journey slowed. The wilderness did not rush transformation. Years stretched ahead, not as punishment, but as necessity. A generation shaped by chains could not immediately become a people shaped by choice. The law traveled with them, not as weapon, but as reminder. The mountain faded into distance, but its demand remained. Remember, do not return, do not replace freedom with familiarity. Chaos would return again and again, not as enemy, but as temptation. The temptation to simplify, to surrender responsibility, to recreate what had once controlled them. The golden calf was not an isolated failure, it was a mirror, and the wilderness would hold that mirror up for many years to come.
Chapter 8. 40 Years of Silence and Resistance.
Time did not move forward in the wilderness. It circled. Days followed nights, seasons repeated themselves. Camps were raised, broken, and raised again. The land changed subtly, but the people did not. What had begun as a journey became something else entirely. Not a march toward a destination, but an extended pause, a long, quiet reckoning. 40 years was not a sentence. It was a process. The wilderness did not punish openly. It resisted quietly. Every attempt to rush forward was met with delay. Every effort to force certainty dissolved into confusion. The land offered enough to survive, but never enough to settle. No city rose. No walls were built. Nothing permanent was allowed to take root. This was not accident. It was design. The people had left Egypt physically, but Egypt still lived within them. Its habits, its fears, its hierarchies remained intact. Slavery had shaped more than their labor. It had shaped their instincts. They had learned to survive by submission, to measure safety through control, to equate authority with permanence. These instincts could not simply be erased. They had to be worn down. And time was the tool. Each year stripped something away. Certainty faded first, then impatience, then expectation. The people learned to live without milestones, without visible progress, without the comfort of knowing how long things would last. This was perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Freedom did not move according to desire. Resistance did not disappear. It transformed. At first, resistance was loud. Complaints echoed through the camp. Why did you bring us here? Why can we not return? Why does nothing change? Over time, the questions softened. Voices grew quieter. Frustration turned inward. The wilderness absorbed anger until it became resignation, then reflection. Children grew up knowing no other world. Egypt became a story, not a memory. They did not remember chains. They remembered movement. They did not long for structure they had never known. Their identity formed differently, not as laborers, but as wanderers. This generational shift mattered more than any law. The elders carried memory like weight. They spoke of rivers and cities, of walls and roofs, of markets and rhythms. To the young, these stories felt distant, almost mythical. Why would anyone choose walls over sky? Why would anyone trade movement for enclosure? The wilderness rewrote desire itself. Moses watched this transformation slowly unfold. Leadership became quieter, less about command, more about endurance. He no longer confronted Pharaoh or shattered idols. He waited. He listened. He mediated conflict not with authority, but memory. He reminded the people who they were becoming, not who they had been. The law traveled with them, but it did not dominate daily life. It surfaced in moments of tension, conflict, and choice. It was consulted, argued with, resisted, and slowly internalized. Law became less external rule and more internal reference, not because fear demanded it, but because survival required coordination. Still, resistance returned in subtler forms. Fear of the unknown remained strong. When scouts spoke of fortified cities ahead, the old reflex resurfaced. We cannot face this. We are not enough. Slavery had taught them to measure themselves against power and always come up short. The wilderness had not yet fully erased that reflex. Each time resistance appeared, movement slowed again. The land responded not with violence, but distance. Paths lengthened, progress reversed, familiar territory returned unexpectedly. The people began to understand something unsettling. The wilderness was not simply terrain. It was responsive. It reflected their internal state outward. When trust weakened, distance increased. When fear dominated, direction dissolved. Silence became the defining feature of these years. Not divine silence, but narrative silence. No new signs, no dramatic confrontations, no spectacles. The extraordinary faded. What remained was ordinary survival. Gathering, resting, moving, repeating. This was the true transformation. A people accustomed to spectacle learned to live without it. Faith no longer depended on miracles, it depended on continuity. The daily appearance of food, the steady presence of guidance, the unbroken rhythm of movement. Slowly, authority shifted. It no longer centered on a single figure or event. Leadership distributed itself. Elders emerged. Councils formed. Disputes were resolved locally. The people learned governance not as domination, but as negotiation. This was something Egypt had never taught them. The wilderness allowed mistakes. It absorbed failure without collapse. That is why 40 years were necessary. A generation shaped by chains could not inherit a future built on choice. They had to pass, not as punishment, but as transition. What remained would be those who had learned freedom without remembering slavery. Moses understood this, even when the people did not. He carried the burden of leading toward a land he would not enter. Leadership, in its deepest form, is often about preparation rather than arrival. As the years passed, the wilderness began to feel less hostile, not because it changed, but because the people did. They no longer demanded certainty. They no longer expected comfort. They moved when they were told to move and rested when told to rest, not out of fear, but trust. Resistance had not disappeared. It had been transformed into caution. Silence did not mean absence. It meant maturity. When the wilderness finally began to thin, when the edge of another land approached, the people standing there were not the ones who had fled Egypt. They were quieter, more deliberate, less reactive. They carried memory without nostalgia and law without fear. They were not perfect. They were ready. The wilderness had done its work. Ahead lay a land filled with walls, cities, and conflict. The danger was not Egypt returning. The danger was becoming Egypt. What came next would test whether the silence had taught them enough.
Chapter 9. The Edge of the Promised Land.
The land appeared gradually, not as revelation, but as suggestion. After years of dust and open sky, hills began to rise. Vegetation thickened. The air carried unfamiliar scents. The wilderness, which had shaped them through absence, slowly gave way to something that hinted at permanence. This was not yet arrival, it was approach, and approach awakened something the wilderness had kept dormant: fear. The edge of the land was not empty, it was inhabited. Cities stood fortified, walls rose where the horizon had once been open, towers cut into the sky. This was not Egypt, but it resembled Egypt in ways that mattered: structures, boundaries, power made visible again. The people stopped moving forward. For decades, the wilderness had removed the need to compare. There were no rivals, no cities to measure against. Survival depended on trust and cooperation, not conquest. Now comparison returned. They measured themselves against walls and found themselves small. Scouts were sent. They returned with conflicting reports. The land was fertile, abundant, alive, but it was also guarded. Its inhabitants were organized, strong. Familiar words resurfaced: giants, fortresses, impossible odds. The language of fear returned, dressed as realism. We cannot face this. We are not enough. It was the old reflex, awakened by proximity to power. Egypt had taught them to see strength as something external. The wilderness had tried to teach them otherwise. At the edge of the land, the lesson was tested. The people argued, voices rose, memory bent backward again. At least Egypt was known. At least slavery had rules. Here, victory was uncertain. Loss felt inevitable. The unknown returned, but this time it wore walls. Moses listened. He did not interrupt immediately. Leadership at this stage was not command, it was discernment. He heard not just fear of battle, but fear of identity. Crossing into the land would end the journey, and endings demand accountability. The wilderness had allowed mistakes without consequence. The land would not. What they faced was not simply an external enemy, it was the risk of becoming what they feared. Cities require governance, walls demand defense, defense demands hierarchy, hierarchy tempts domination. Egypt had been built on this logic. To enter the land without losing themselves required more than courage, it required restraint. The people did not see this yet. They spoke of returning, of choosing a new leader, of undoing everything they had endured. Freedom felt fragile at the edge of permanence. Movement had protected them from responsibility. Settlement would remove that protection. The decision that followed was not dramatic. It was quiet and devastating. They would not enter yet. The wilderness returned, not as punishment, but as delay. The land remained visible, always just beyond reach. The people moved along its borders, tasting nearness without arrival. Years stretched again. Those who had known Egypt most clearly began to fade from the camp, not erased violently, but replaced slowly. Time completed what escape had begun. Moses understood the weight of this moment more deeply than anyone. He had led them out. He had endured their doubt. He had mediated their failures. Now he stood at the edge of fulfillment, knowing he would not cross with them. Leadership often ends before resolution. The role is to prepare others for what one will not possess. The law remained their compass, not as weapon, but as memory. It reminded them of restraint when fear suggested aggression. It reminded them of humility when success seemed near. The land ahead would tempt them to forget the wilderness, to forget dependence, to forget why they had been freed. Moses spoke to them often during this time, not with commands, but with stories. He reminded them of Egypt not as nostalgia, but as warning. He spoke of slavery as something that could return in new forms, not chains, but control, not Pharaoh, but fear. Do not become what you escaped. As the years passed, the people changed again. The memory of Egypt dimmed further. The wilderness no longer felt like exile, it felt like foundation. Those who would enter the land had learned patience. They had lived without certainty. They had survived without accumulation. They understood that permanence was dangerous if it erased humility. The land remained ahead, waiting. When the time finally came, it was not announced with fire or thunder. The decision emerged organically. Movement resumed. The people advanced not as desperate escapees, but as a collective shaped by absence and restraint. Moses climbed one last height. From there he saw the land spread before him, valleys, rivers, cities, promise made visible. He did not cross. His role was complete. The journey had not been about arrival, it had been about transformation. The people descended without him. What awaited them was not paradise, it was complexity, choice, conflict. The wilderness had stripped them, the land would test what remained. Egypt had fallen behind them long ago. The true danger now was forgetting why. The edge of the land was not the end of the story. It was the moment where memory became responsibility.
Chapter 10. Legacy, the End of Pharaoh and the Birth of Memory.
The story does not end with arrival. It never did. The land received them without ceremony. No thunder echoed from the sky. No walls collapsed at their approach. The rivers flowed as they always had. Cities stood unaware that history had shifted beneath their foundations. The people crossed into the land quietly, carrying dust on their feet and memory in their breath. Moses did not follow. From the height where he stood, the land unfolded like a promise finally visible. Valleys and hills, water and stone, permanence after movement. He had carried this image for years, not as possession, but as direction. Now it existed without him. Leadership rarely ends with reward. More often, it ends with release. Moses died outside the land, and with him, something else ended. Not belief, not law, but immediacy. The age of spectacle was over. No more seas parting, no more fire on mountains, no more voices echoing from cloud and flame. What remained was memory, and memory is heavier than miracles. The people settled slowly. The wilderness did not leave them entirely. Its lessons lingered. Movement had shaped them. Silence had disciplined them. They built cities, but not like Egypt. They raised walls, but remembered what walls could become. They formed leaders, but remembered Pharaoh. At least for a time. Egypt did not vanish from the world. Its temples still stood, its gods were still named, pharaohs still ruled. But Egypt's meaning had changed. It was no longer eternity. It was an example, a warning etched into collective memory. The pharaoh who had opposed Moses faded into lineage. His name was absorbed into lists and monuments. Kings followed kings. Dynasties rose and fell. Egypt endured, but it was no longer unquestioned. The illusion of permanence had been broken, and that fracture echoed far beyond one land. The people carried the story forward not as conquest, but as inheritance. They spoke of water opening and fire descending, not to glorify power, but to explain restraint. The story became law, and the law became story. Not a myth to entertain, but a memory to anchor identity. Something new had been born. Not a nation defined by blood or empire, but by memory and choice. A people who believed that freedom was fragile, that power must be limited, that authority without accountability becomes oppression. This belief would be tested again and again. Kings would rise among them, temples would be built, armies would march, and slowly, subtly, Egypt would try to return, not as a place, but as a mindset. The desire for certainty, the temptation of control, the comfort of visible power. The story of Moses existed to interrupt that return. Whenever power grew absolute, the memory resurfaced. Whenever leaders claimed divine right, the wilderness whispered back. Whenever idols were raised, the golden calf waited in reminder. Whenever law hardened into domination, the mountain stood in memory, burning but not consumed. This is why the story endured. Not because it promised safety, but because it warned against forgetting. The end of Pharaoh was not his defeat in water. It was the loss of his model of the world, a universe where power flows downward, where order justifies suffering, where eternity belongs to those who control. In its place emerged something quieter and far more dangerous to empires, the idea that no power is absolute, that no ruler is divine, that freedom requires discipline, that memory must be preserved, not rewritten. This belief did not conquer the world, it haunted it. It moved through stories, through laws, through resistance. It appeared in unexpected places, carried by people who remembered bondage and feared its return. It challenged kings, it unsettled empires, it refused to stay buried. And yet, it was never safe. Memory fades, stories shorten, laws become tools, the wilderness grows distant. New generations ask different questions. Why limits? Why restraint? Why not become strong like others? This is where the story becomes unfinished. Every generation stands again at the edge of the land. Every society must decide whether it will remember the wilderness or rebuild Egypt, whether it will carry law as responsibility or wield it as control, whether freedom will remain a practice or collapse into spectacle. The story of Moses does not ask for belief, it asks for recognition. Recognition that the greatest danger is not oppression imposed from outside, but certainty grown from within. That the most seductive idol is not made of gold, but of order without memory. The sea no longer parts, the mountain no longer burns, the voice no longer speaks from cloud, but the choice remains. The story ends where it always has, not with victory, not with a rival, but with responsibility. And somewhere, beyond monuments and empires, the wilderness still waits.